Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and this is My Life as a Landlord. I'm so pleased you've joined me for today's show. Today, we are exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for New York State. Just New York State, nothing else. We're going to talk about all the nuances that go on in New York. Oh my goodness. And in all of my location-specific episodes, I have included lots of hyperlinks to all kinds of resources, in this case for New York State, in the description of this episode. So if you want to know more, please go to the description. There is tons and tons of resources for you, including all of the documents that I'm going to screen share with you today. Each of my location-specific podcasts is set up the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of the tenancy law in that location? What are some of the nuances in that location? What stands out? Some guidance about the abandoned items left behind by a tenant in that location, and then where to get help in your local area. And I must tell you, there are more resources and more guiding documents than what I'm going to go through with you. This is not everything. This will get you started and it'll give you some guidance. There may be other things in your city, state, county, could be anything that are more appropriate to your specific situation. So there's all kinds of items, especially in New York, whether you're in a regulated unit, a non-regulated unit, you've got to register your rental, or maybe you need to be licensed. There's a bunch of stuff that you need to work on for your specific rental in New York State. So it's not all inclusive. You must research further in your specific area, but today's episode will get you started, and at least I'll give you some ideas if you get stuck. I do want to give a plug today for our sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you want to know more about real estate investing, check out alohajv.com. That's Aloha Capital Investments, LLC, alohajv.com. Okay, let's get right into this. Basics in New York real property law. Let me screen share. So if you're watching at My Life as a Landlord on YouTube, you can see. Okay, whoops, let's do that one. I'm just sharing the screen, and here we are. Okay, so Chapter 50 is real property law that includes landlord-tenant law in New York State. Now, for those of you who have seen this, or maybe you've seen a couple of the landlord-specific or location-specific episodes, the governing doctrine, the governing document is always it's a law. It's legalese because it's a law. And so this is the law part of that. Article 7 is landlord and tenant, and you can see there's a bunch of drop-down menus. Lots of sections, very, very legalese, just, termination of certain contracts by senior citizens. I mean, it just goes on and on, all kinds of different details, good cause eviction law. It goes on and on. But this is hard to digest, especially if I'm trying to do a podcast on this. If you want to look at this and you want to read it, I encourage you to, at least to get very familiar with it. But let's go to some of the derivative documents that come from this law. So I found this one. New York State Attorney General Letitia James has created a residential tenants' rights guide. Now I'm going to go through several other documents. This is not the only one we're going to do, but she's actually made this really easy, where we're talking about the types of tenancies in types of rentals in New York State, leases, rent, lease succession or termination, habitability and repairs, safety precautions, and there's other stuff. I'm not going to cover all of that, and I'm not going to go into super detail on all of it, but because New York State is so ingrained with lots and lots of rentals, and then of course you've got the different boroughs, which we'll talk about, different counties and different cities. Of course, New York City's got their own additional requirements as well. This is really complicated, and it's very yeah, and we'll just go with complicated. Okay, so 2 types of housing rent regulation in New York State: rent control and rent stabilization. It depends on which you're in. And so when you're talking, you're going to see this throughout this episode, that either you've got a regulated unit or a non-regulated unit, and it depends on what you're working with, and how it becomes regulated or not is also dependent on how big the building is, how many units are in it, how old it is. It's really interesting how detailed this gets. So yeah, so let's talk about the difference between rent control and rent stabilization. Rent control limits the rent an owner may charge for an apartment and restricts the right of the owner to evict the tenants. Rent control program applies to residential buildings constructed before 1947. So these are old buildings before 1947, but in municipalities that have not declared an end to the post-war rental housing emergency. So here it is. Rent control is still in effect in New York City, parts of Albany, Erie, Nassau, I can't even say that one, Rensselaer, yeah, Schenectady, Westchester counties. So rent control, basically, for an apartment to be under rent control, the tenant or tenant's lawful successor, such as a family member, spouse, or adult lifetime partner, must have been living there continuously since before 1971, and in some situations, even longer. When a rent-controlled apartment is vacated in New York City or most other localities, it becomes rent stabilized. In New York City, each rent-controlled apartment has a maximum base rent that is adjusted every 2 years to reflect changes in operating costs, but the tenant's rents cannot exceed maximum collectible rent, which is adjusted annually and based on average of past 5 years rent guideline board orders. Yeah, it goes on and on. So it can't just jump up. So rent control, basically, if someone's moved in 1947, you know, if they're there for a long time, and I forget, there's always one person somewhere in New York City that has been in their apartment for 50, 80 years, whatever, and they're paying $100 in rent, and it won't go up, or it can't go up. And so that's what they pay. But there's other fees that may be assessed on them as they go through. But let's say they vacate that unit. Well, that doesn't just instantly jump up to market rent. It doesn't quite work like that. You're going to see this. It gets very complicated very quickly. That's rent control. So we'll just talk about this. That's rent control. Rent stabilization is a little bit different. Rent stabilization in New York City, apartments that are generally under rent stabilization are an apartment that is not otherwise rent controlled in a building built before 1974 with 6 or more units. You see how the layers of details is getting crazier and crazier. Formerly rent controlled apartment that became vacant without a lawful successor, so then it goes from rent control now into rent stabilized. And in a building with 3 or more apartments constructed or extensively renovated on or after 1974 with special tax benefits. So outside of New York City, rent stabilized apartments are generally found in buildings with 6 or more apartments that were built before January 1974. So there is a bunch of rent stabilized details. So rent control doesn't just apply in certain cases, it's also rent stabilized, and both are complicated. I'm not even sure I'm completely tracking all of it. In fact, I think once we get done with all the location specific episodes, I'm very likely going to come back to New York, because I need an expert on here to kind of go through this. It is just sort of a rat's nest of rules and requirements, and I'm not sure I'm tracking all of it. I'm going to do my best today. And if you are a new landlord in New York, good on you. I want to make sure that you have some locations to get some help, because this is not for the faint-hearted. And I will tell you that as a landlord of 15 years and counting. Okay, here we go. Government finance housing. That's again, there's government finance housing everywhere, not just in New York State, but there's Section 8 housing programs, and then there's other special housing types like mobile home parks, loft owners and tenants, residential hotel owners. So there's more details and all that. So here it moves on to a lease. A lease is a contract between a landlord and a tenant, and then you guys agree a minimum. A lease should identify the premises, specify the names and addresses of the parties, the amount due at rent, the duration of the rental, conditions of occupancy, and New York City rent stabilized tenants are entitled to receive a fully executed copy of their signed lease from their landlords within 30 days of signing the lease. The lease beginning and end dates must be stated, and the rent stabilized tenants must be given the rent stabilization lease rider prepared by DHCR, which is New York State Divisions of Homes and Community Renewal, which summarizes the rights under law. Yeah, so then you've got lease provisions. So lease provisions, there's always a bit in leases of what a landlord can't put in a lease. And it basically says it can't, a tenant can't exempt themselves from being liable. You can't exempt, the landlord can't just walk away and throw their hands up and not be, liable for providing a safe unit. You can't require tenants to pledge their household furniture as security. Clearly, this has happened in the past, right? That's why it's in there. A landlord cannot waive their warranty of habitability. There is, and there's others. So we'll just keep going. Lease renewals, non-rent regulated lease renewals. So now that we have, rent control, rent stabilized, defined as best as I can do it. Now you've got non-rent regulated leases, and then you're renewing the lease. So if the landlord is non-regulated unit intends to renew the lease with a rent increase of more than 5%, or they don't intend to renew the lease, they must provide advance written notice. And it gives you the days, right? It's either 90 days, 60 days, or 30 days. But basically, the longer you've lived in the unit, the longer the notice is that you have to renew. Okay. Now, if you're going to renew a regulated lease, there is some special information about that where, rent stabilized tenants have the right to choose a 1 or a 2-year lease renewal, must be on the same terms and conditions as the prior lease unless it's a specific law or regulation changes it. And then for New York City rent stabilized tenants, the landlord must give written notice to the tenant right to renewal by mail or personal delivery. You can't give them to them too early, right? You can't give it to them earlier than 150 days, so 5 months in advance, and not less than 90 days. So that sweet spot, somewhere between 3 and 4 months out, you have to, or more than 3. So I guess it would be 4 and 5 months out. You have to give them the mail saying that you're going to renew. And then after the notice of renewal is given, the tenant has 60 days in which to accept. So again, you can see there's a ton of moving parts. In no other state that I've been researching recently is it this complicated, and we're just starting. So it's pretty incredible. Month-to-month tenants are kind of on their own. They've got their own set of requirements as they're moving forward. Rent charges. When an apartment is not rent regulated, a landlord can charge basically whatever they want, and they have to agree, the tenant and the landlord have to agree. But if the apartment is subject to rent regulation, the initial rent and subsequent rent increases are set by law and may be challenged by a tenant at any time. However, the recovery of a rent overcharge is limited to either 4 or 6 years preceding the complaint, depending on when the complaint is made. So if a former tenant, has realized that they've been overcharged, it's too late. It could be too late. Late fees. This is always something I try to bring up is late rent. A rent payment can only be considered late if it's more than 5 days after it's due. So there's an automatic grace period. Not all places are like that, but the most your landlord can charge as a late fee is $50 or 5% of your monthly rent, whichever is less. And then receipt. If somebody pays in whatever method they pay, they've got to have some kind of a receipt in some way. Yeah. Okay. And then rent increases. We talked a little bit about this already. Rent increases for non-regulated apartments. I guess we talked about renewals a bit. But yeah, it depends on non-regulated apartments. If you're increasing the rent more than 5%, then you have to give advance notice. You have to give them proper notice. And then rent increases for regulated apartments. Maximum rent increases for rent stabilized apartment are set each year by local rent guideline boards, which my understanding is these boards are different in each location. So it is very possible that you could have different rent amounts permitted, increases permitted throughout New York State. So it continues. Landlords are no longer permitted to increase rent regulated unit by 20% when it becomes vacant, known as the vacancy bonus. The related longevity bonus when the departed tenant has lived in the unit for 8 years or more is also prohibited. The landlord is now required to only increase the rent by the amount, even if it has been rent controlled before, rent stabilized before. In most cases, landlords are no longer allowed to take an apartment out of rent regulation when it exceeds the high rent threshold. This is where I get really confused because this doesn't make sense to me, and this is why I need an expert on the show here. You've got a high rent threshold and the apartment becomes vacant. Also, deregulation is no longer permitted in most cases if the tenant is considered high income. Yeah, I don't understand all this. But I can tell you that there's a lot of people in New York who do. And it says specifically right here, if you want to check rent history on, so it says tenants should check the rent history, potentially both deregulation. So if you've got a question, you can contact the Office of the Attorney General, or you can call the Office of Rent Administration. I'll give you the number, 833-499-0343. And then there is also a website. There's a couple of contacts that I'm going to give to you at the end of the show as well. So you can go through this because I'm not really sure I track all of this. And here's the thing, if you have a rental to, maybe it doesn't make sense to you, or maybe it doesn't apply to you, but it doesn't apply to me and it doesn't make sense to me. So we'll get through some of this. Substantial improvements for rent regulated units. I do understand that if there is a major capital improvement known as an MCI that would benefit all of the tenants in a building, such as a replacement of a boiler or plumbing, that the landlord may apply a increase of rent to their rent stabilized units, but they have to have permission to do that. The amount of the landlord can raise the rents due to MCI is now capped at 2% of their current rent per year, and there's no retroactive amount. So you can tell every time they throw little things in there like no retroactive amount, that landlords in the past have tried to do this, right? They've gone back and said, hey, I needed this, we're going to make this retroactive. You owe me 2 years or 5 years of also additional fees to pay for this boiler or whatever. Also, there's a note in here that major capital improvement increases cannot be added to your rent. If there are any hazardous or immediately hazardous violation at your building, the landlord must fix these violations before any authorized additional charges can be added. Also, there's another addition in here. It says major capital improvement increases are not permitted if fewer than 35% of the apartments in the building are rent regulated, meaning you have to take part in the whole program before you can recoup some of this costs. The other one that could be added on is called individual apartment improvements, IAIs. Landlords are also permitted to increase rents for improvements made to individual apartments, for example, new flooring, new fixtures, or other improvements. Typically, these improvements occur when the unit is vacant, but could also be made while the unit is occupied with written approval from the tenant. To increase the rent because of an IAI, the landlord must take before and after photos, maintain permanent records of the improvement, and submit documentation to the state. And then they're limited on the amount that can be collected based on this. So if you're going to improve a unit, I think so the landlord can only claim up to 3 IAIs in a 15-year period. Total costs eligible for a rent increase calculation cannot exceed $15,000 per unit, and they're temporary and they must be removed from the rent after 30 years. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so per month you can increase in buildings that are more than 35 apartments. The landlord can collect a permanent rent increase equal to 180th of the cost of the improvement to a maximum of $83 per month. And if it's if it's less than 35 apartments, the landlord may collect a permanent rent increase to a maximum of $89 per month. And of course, there's a calculation with all this. Rent increase exemptions, all kinds of different exemptions, depending on folks who are senior citizens, living with a disability, low income housing tenant. There's just a list of exempted folks that don't get rent increases. And then if you've got rent controlled tenants in the past, landlords could raise rent for rent controlled tenants up to 7.5% a year, in addition to a fuel pass along charges, plus the major capital improvements and individual apartment improvement charges on top of that. And they've stopped some of that. Let's see. And now a landlord is limited to increasing a rent controlled tenants by the average of the 5 most recent. Yeah, so you basically have most recent rent guide board annual rent increases for 1-year lease renewals, or 7.5, whichever is less. And landlords cannot charge for fuel costs to rent controlled tenants anymore. So it looks like landlords in the past have really pushed the charges onto the tenants. And it's tough. And so in each of these sections, it says, if you believe your landlord is not following the law related to rent increases, you can make a complaint to New York State Department Homes and Community Renewal at hcr.ny.gov. And it continues. I mean, this goes on and on. So preferential rent overcharges. This is particularly interesting. This rent overcharge, let me just say it, it's a penalty. It's not allowed, but it's basically, it's a payment that the tenant gives the landlord outside of the lease. This is just basically money in their hand. So, and it says in here, generally the penalty for a rent overcharge, wait a minute. No, it says, in New York City and certain communities in Nassau, Rockland, Westchester counties where rent stabilization and rent control laws apply, the landlord may not charge more than the legal regulated rent. Landlords must register each stabilized apartment with the DHCR and provide tenants annually with a copy of the registration statement. So basically what's happening is the charge, this overcharge, is something that the tenant is paying the landlord outside the lease. And so it can be, you can take that as it want. It looks like a bribe to me, but it could be a mistake. Maybe it's not a mistake, but it talks about security deposits, how this all works. It's got to be in a New York wait, it's very, why does New York have to be so complicated? So your security deposit can't be more than 1 month rent amount, and landlords of buildings with 6 or more apartments must put all security deposits in a New York bank account, earning interest at the prevailing rate. Each tenant must be informed in writing of the bank's name and address and the amount of the deposit, and landlords are entitled to collect an annual administrative expense of 1% of the deposit, and then the remaining interest must be paid to the tenant. And they can be given the option of having the interest paid to them annually, applied to rent, or paid at the end of the lease term. If the building has fewer than 6 apartments, a landlord who voluntarily places security deposits in an interest-bearing bank account must also follow these rules. So it depends on how many units are in the building that you have. Getting a security deposit back in non-regulated units, these are all different. And so you can see very quickly that you've got non-regulated versus regulated units, how the vacating of the units are determined, what happens when a sale of a building occurs. Lease succession, they talk a lot about subletting or assigning leases. What's the difference? And then how to do this. Now, there is actually, let me look at this one. There is actually something very interesting that if somebody wants to assign the lease, or is it apartment sharing? There's one in here that has to do with the number of occupants, and I'm trying to find where that is. Let's see. Hang on with me for a second. Okay, I'm just going to keep going because it just seems very, very specific. Very specific. Oh, I really want to find that one. Okay, well, we'll keep going as we can. Sublet allowance. There's a lot of terms in here I've never heard before, like a sublet allowance, assigning a lease, apartment sharing. Apartment sharing, this is interesting. Lease succession rights, like who can take over a lease, especially when you've got these rent controlled, rent stabilized units. It's very specific because it can be grandfathered in. Yeah. It's really interesting how this all works in New York. Same thing with lease termination. There's very specific requirements for senior citizens, individuals living with a disability, and how, if you're going to displace them, how's that going to work? Personnel, military personnel, lease terminations, victims of domestic violence. Now, when it comes to safety items, then there's got to be a quick, it's a safety issue that you've got not just domestic violence, there are other criminal activity requirements, also things like human trafficking or sexual assault, things like that. The landlord has to let the tenant out of the lease quickly, right? But it also has to be criminally substantive. Like, you have to have a police report. You can't just say it. So it's really interesting how this all works, and it's incredibly specific. Like, you really have to know how to do this. Even me, and I'm about as anal as you can get. I want to make sure that I understand this, but I do not have a rental in New York State, and my goodness, I don't know if I want to. Okay, so here we go. We keep talking about evictions, allowable reasons for eviction despite having a lease. Then there's talking about tenant protections during eviction. Non-payment. So it talks all about different aspects of a tenant misbehaving or a tenant not paying to cancel a lease or to terminate a lease. And same thing if the landlord is not repairing. The next part is warranty of habitability. This is all making sure everything's working properly, not infected with insects, things like that. Again, we're talking about rent reduction. What happens if you're in a situation where things are timing out and you paid for it? Rent reduction, or if a tenant has to pay for a repair themselves, they are allowed to take that out of the rent with proper notice. Landlord's duty to repair, that's typical in just about every place. Lead-based paint. There's a lot of discussion about lead-based paint in US rentals. This is actually a federal law. You have to declare this. We even have to do it in Hawaii. And you've got to disclose all kinds of things about lead-based paint. Because most of our stuff is brand new, we don't have any issues with it. And it's not this is not a thing in Canada yet. There are other things in Canada, but not this one. I'm going to keep going. There are definitely different aspects in here. New York City is its own one-off, but you've also got the city of Rochester and the city of Buffalo. Those are all different, have their own different health codes when it comes to housing. So if you are a landlord in any of those areas, make sure you are taking a look. Safety items, including smoke detector, carbon monoxide detectors, and then of course, crime prevention. You want to make sure your entrance door locks, intercoms, everything's operational. Good lighting is also a good thing. You want to make sure it's sufficiently lit at night. Lobby attendance service. Yeah, here's one. It says tenants of multiple dwellings with 8 or more apartments are entitled to maintain a lobby attendant service for their safety and security at their own expense wherever an attendant provided by the landlord is not on duty. So the tenants can actually hooey up and pay for a lobby attendant as well. Elevator mirrors, this is important. There must be a mirror in each self-service elevator in multiple dwellings so that people may see prior to entering if anyone is already in the elevator. Individual locks, peepholes, mailboxes. This is really interesting. Window guards. This is something that we don't normally have. Landlords in New York City must install window guards at the request of a tenant in any apartment in which a child under the age of 10 resides, whether it's requested or not. You must do it. Landlords are required to provide tenants with a form stating whether there are children residing in the household and request the installation of window guards. And they're required to notify their landlord when the children of this age living in the apartment or provide childcare services in the apartment. And the tenants may not refuse installation. This is really interesting. I've never seen this before. Once window guards are installed, the tenants must not make alterations to or remove any part of the guard. Landlords in New York City must install the specific Department of Health and Mental Hygiene approved window guards. Yeah. interesting. Utility services, heating, truth in heating, hot water, continuation of utility service, oil payments. And of course, you cannot, as a landlord, you cannot cut off a tenant, even a non-paying or misbehaving tenant, you cannot cut off their utilities. Tenants' personal protections, tenant organizations, talks in here about retaliation. And if you've heard me on other podcasts say it's illegal for landlords in New York to retaliate against the tenants for participating in tenant organizations. Excuse me. For participating in tenant organizations. It's also illegal for landlords in New York to retaliate against tenants who make a good faith complaint to them or a government agency about violations of health and safety laws, issues with habitability or non-repair of premises, violation of rights or under lease, or rent gouging. And when it comes to retaliation, I see this a lot in these different location specific episodes. The number one thing I look at is what is the time? Because sometimes it's it's really quick, and sometimes it's not. And what do I mean? So it says right here, this is New York State still, within 1 year of a tenant's complaint, the landlord substantially alters the term of a tenant's rental agreement that presumes that the landlord is retaliating, or if the landlord brings an eviction case within 1 year. So in this case, the retaliation timeline is 1 year. It's not 1 year everywhere, but here it is. So that's pretty interesting. You've got to really understand how this works. Right to privacy. This is talking about landlord accessing, making sure that you can actually, the landlord's not taking advantage of that. Folks with disabilities, you have to make reasonable accommodation. That's a federal law anyway. Discrimination, same thing. You've got fair housing, but there's also state aspects of that as well. Harassment and pets. Let's talk about this. Tenants that may keep their pets in the apartment unless their lease specifically prohibits it. Landlords may be able to evict tenants who violate a lease provision prohibiting pets. Yeah. You gotta, I'm just gonna leave it there. I could go on and on, but pets are always a sticking point, no matter where the rental is. And if it's a no pet location, you really got to understand why. And if you put up with it for a long time, then guess what? You've kind of just agreed to have a pet there. So we'll just leave it at that. And then we get into manufactured and mobile homes. I'm not going to go there. Rent to own, no. Finding an apartment. Okay, so one thing that is a thing in New York is having someone represent you as a tenant to find a apartment. So it says real estate brokers, a consumer may retain a real estate broker to find a suitable apartment. New York State licenses real estate brokers and salespersons, and brokers charge a commission for their services, which is usually stated a percentage of the first year's rent. The amount of the commission is not set by law and should be negotiated by the parties. The broker must assist the client in finding and obtaining an apartment before a commission may be charged, and the fee should not be paid until the client is offered to sign a lease by the landlord. Yeah, and you got to be careful because you don't want it to look like you're charging a fee to somebody who's your buddy. So it says specifically in there, a broker's commission may be considered rent in excess of legal rent when there's too close a business or financial connection between the broker and the landlord. So sometimes that happens where they're all buds, right? Information sharing agencies, and then fees. This is about the application fees. Before signing a lease, the most a landlord can charge for a background or a credit check is $20. And the landlord must provide the applicant a copy of the check that was, or the report that was provided, credit or background check, as well as an invoice from the company that performed it. A landlord is prohibited from charging an applicant for a credit or background check if they fail to provide the applicant with a copy. The applicant can provide their own background and credit check to avoid any fees as long as it was performed within the last 30 days, which is what we do. So key money is where you charge a prospective tenant additional fees above lawful rent and a security deposit. And basically what it is, it's a bribe for preference in renting a vacant apartment. Key money is not to be confused with fees that may be legally charged by a licensed real estate broker, but it is illegal to charge key money, which is basically just money that a landlord can take just so that people will pick them. Tenant screening reports or tenant blacklists. I swear this is the #1 question that comes up on Facebook, is saying, hey, I just had a tenant. We just had it to evict the tenant. Can I warn other landlords of this? And unfortunately, they can't. A landlord cannot deny a tenant application or apartment, rental home, or any other type of rental based on past legal conflict with a landlord. Yeah, interesting. Interesting. And then, of course, at the very bottom of this is a bunch of resources. Offices of the New York Attorney General, DHCR, Division of Homes and Community Renewal, Rent Administration, and there's a bunch of locations, right? Rents, New York City Rent Guidelines Board, which is rentguidelinesboard.cityofnewyork.us. That's the website. And there's a bunch of, I have this on the description of the episode. So if you want to go through this and you can see it, you certainly can. But let me make sure I've gotten everything. We talked about the tenant application fee. We talked about key money being illegal. We talked about security deposit method. And they do have pre-made forms. We're going to talk about the forms next. In fact, let me jump to the forms. This is how you check if a unit is rent regulated or not. You can go to portal.hcr.ny.gov, and I have that hyperlink also in the episode description. And what you do is you will literally just go in and you go, am I rent stabilized? And you put in your name, your first name, last name, email address, and then your phone, and then the subject building address. You put in the address of the rental that you're inquiring about, presumably before you rent it, and they will send you, looks like it'll be mailed to you within 20 business days. So it's not exactly quick, but it is an option to find out what's going on. Okay, let me find the forms. Here's the forms right here. So this is www.newyork.nycourts.gov. So www.nycourts.gov/forms/landlord-tenant. And you've got forms, all kinds of forms here. So for landlords, guide for non-payment of eviction inside New York City, outside New York City. And of course, I'm screen sharing all this on YouTube. So if you're listening to this, wondering what I'm talking about, you can screen share, or you can go to YouTube and watch this. But all these links are in the description. So 5-day past due notice, written demand for past due. And some of these you can see, one of them is just a plain PDF that you can fill out. One of them is a fillable PDF that you can fill it and then print it. Yeah, so there's different forms. There's not too many of them. There's 6 forms for landlords, 2 forms, 1 form for tenants. Oh, and then it goes on further. Okay, so there's more. As you scroll down, there's more. Yeah, so let's open one of these up. So 5-day notice past due rent. Let's just open in a new tab. Okay. So 5-day notice of past due rent, landlord John Doe, tenant Jane Doe, property description. You put all this information. Property is used as a business or residence. List the names of every tenant on the premises. And so it just basically says you've not paid rent for the month of whatever. It is more than 5 days past due, total rent owed. And then you fill it out the bottom and then you print it. So it's typical. That's pretty typical. So anyway, so you have some pre-made forms. That's good. They are specific on lease wording. We talked about pet deposit, pet rent. There is guidance about pets, but nothing about additional rent or deposits. But it does say that you can use your security deposit to recover damages caused by a pet, right? So if a dog or a cat causes damage, that is. Delivery of signed lease required. Yes, if you're in a rent regulated apartment, it is due from the landlord within 30 days of signing. Condition inspection at move-in. The answer is yes. Grace period for paying rent is automatically 5 days, and there is a late fee. Most they can charge is $50 or 5%, whichever is less. Rent increases we've talked about a bit. We've also defined the terms vacancy bonus and longevity bonus. End of a fixed lease. Yeah, we talked about that. return of deposit. So for a non-rent stabilized or non-rent controlled units, security deposit must be returned within 14 days. And rent regulated units, landlord must return security deposit to the tenant less lawful deduction at the end of the lease within a reasonable time after. And you do, if you want to go and file a complaint, New York State Attorney General Office is, but if you're talking eviction, you file with the courts, which is nycourts.gov, which is this one that I'm screen sharing at the moment. You can file that. Yeah, non-payment eviction holdover appoint, yeah. And nuances. So lease provisions, we've talked about a lot of this about rent overcharges, military personnel. I think we've talked about just about all of this as far as nuances. Oh, let's talk about abandoned property. I think that's the next one, is abandoned property, tenants and abandoned property laws in New York State. Hang on a second. So most states allow landlords to sell or dispose of personal property their tenants leave behind after a conviction. Bailment laws. So basically, hang on just a sec here. Okay, so talking about abandoned property. Let's see, I'm just looking down here. I found this at sapling.com. This was New York State law. I think this is an article that was all about landlord's duties, but it's pretty typical that the landlord does not have a right to legally dispose of a tenant's remaining property unless they were intended. Let's see, reasonable, yeah. So landlord's bailment responsibilities include providing written notice to the evicted tenant, allowing them to retrieve possessions within a reasonable time, and the reasonable depends on the specifics of the abandonment or eviction. Generally, landlords should provide tenants at least 30 days written notice to claim their property. And then if a tenant fails to reclaim property after reasonable opportunity, the landlord can sell the property, discard, or place them in storage. Tenants can sue their landlords for failing to safeguard their items. And then, yeah, one of the comments that was on here, since state laws can and frequently do change, you want to seek legal advice for sure. And they have a number of states in here, not just New York. So that's important that you know that if you're in that situation, that you've got abandoned items, that you want to make sure you are looking at that. Okay, so where to get help in New York State? Let me go up to this. So you want to go to Office of New York State Attorney General, which is and let's see, NY, nope, that's the Senate. ag.ny.gov is the State Attorney General's office. And then a number of, I'm just screen sharing here what the resources. So Offices of Attorney General, the hotline, if you want to call someone, 800-771-7755. New York State Divisions of Homes and Community Renewal. General information, you can email the info@hcr.ny.gov. Their website is hcr.ny.gov, and rent administration is at phoning 833-499-0343. And then, of course, they have a number of other locations. New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and then they've got, let's see, what else can I give you? New York City Communication City Loft Board. There's just a bunch in here. So again, go to New York State Attorney General Letitia James website, and at the very bottom of that, ag.ny.gov, there's probably 30 different ways, different places, and somebody will get you help on whatever your situation, whatever your question is. They will get you to the right person to get your questions answered. So just as a wrap up, each of my location specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way, answering the exact same 4 questions. In this case, what are the basics of New York State tenancy laws? What are the nuances of New York State and what's different? Some of the guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant, and then where to get help in your local state or province. This is the same format for every location-specific episode. So if you're interested in another geographic area, you already know what I'm going to talk about, just in a different location. One more time, this episode is not all-inclusive, and as you can see, New York State is super complicated. You must research further in your specific area, including your city, county, regional district, parish, city, or other governing body that involves your rental location, but today's episode will at least get you started. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are that you already are, or you are about to be a landlord in New York State. Things you can do to help yourself are to familiarize and read the New York real property law, and 2, go to an in-person meeting of some kind. One idea is you can go to your local meetup group in your city, county, state, and then how do you find those? You can jump on social media, just Google New York Landlord Meetup or New York Real Estate Meetup, and I guarantee you'll have all kinds of results if you want to do something in person. Social media, there is very likely, I know there's national landlord Facebook groups, and there are also very specific Facebook groups for landlords in different locations. I would be willing to bet money there is a New York landlord Facebook group. So make sure you jump on that if that's what you want to do. Get to where the local folks are asking questions just like you are in your local area. If you've learned something from today's show, could you pretty please give me a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, whether it was Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or maybe you listen to this on the website, mylifeasalandlord.com. It doesn't matter, but your input really does help. I hope you enjoyed today's show all about New York State. Today, I recorded this episode on the cruise ship Carnival Splendor floating off of the coast of New Zealand. Real estate takes you places. Where do you want it to take you? Join me in the next episode live right now in the library. The next episode is episode 127, all about California. I'll see you there.